everybody. This is Alexander Schacht. I'm chair of the Benefit-Risk Special Interest Group of FSPI and PSI. And this webinar is brought to you by PSI, which was also a functionality. PSI has, as you know, has a great conference that is happening in June next year in Amsterdam, 36th of June, and the abstracts for this conference are now can be submitted up to 24th of November. So if you have any interesting thing to share, please submit something for this very great conference. I'm pretty sure Amsterdam will be a great location for the conference. In terms of this webinar, you registered probably via our blog, Benefit-Risk-Assessment.com. You can subscribe there to get any news, what's happening from the Benefit-Risk group, and so you don't miss any of announcements like this webinar in the future. So please go to www.benefit-risk-assessment.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Now with these early introductions, I want to thank Kevin Marsh to present today. I'm very, very proud that we have him as a speaker today, given his amazing experience in this field. So he is an expert in preference information, preference elicitation, and decision analysis. He has published quite extensively on this area. Quite notably are the outcomes from the ISPOR task force on MCDA with their guidance on how to do this. There are two papers that are also, the references can be found on our blog. He has applied these different methodologies in a range of different organizations, including regulatory and industry clients. So notably also the NICE is included here and the National Institute for Health Research. Kevin is quite prolific in terms of his publication experience, and he has a very good background in terms of that. He has education originally from the University of Bath, specializing in economic valuation techniques. He also spent a year at Oxford and later joined also Campbell and Cochrane Economic Methods Group. And so he has lots of different topics that he's covering. With that, I want to just make a short note regarding questions. We will have a question and answer session after Kevin's presentation. And through the presentation, you can always type in your questions into the chat functionality of GoToWebinar. We will then summarize all these questions, and I will moderate them at the end together with Kevin. So please post your questions into the chat functionality. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to Kevin. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alexander, and thank you all for listening today. I'm going to talk to the topic, does patient preference have a role in health technology assessment today? I'm going to dwell a little bit on current practice in relation to incorporating patient preferences into HTA. We'll probably spend most time considering what the actual potential is. Given the infancy of this topic, we'll explore not only what we're doing at the minute, but what we see as the potential for that kind of data to support health technology assessment. So by way of overview, I'll first of all start with what I mean by patient preferences. There are a number of terms used to refer to different ways of engaging patients in decision-making processes. I think it's worthwhile just being clear about precisely what it is we are referring to. And in that section, I'll also dwell on, given that definition of patient preferences, what are the regulatory agencies doing? I think that's important context, given other initiatives which we won't really dwell on today about the potential synergies between regulatory and reimbursement data requirements. I think it's important to understand that as context. So I'll touch briefly on that. I'll then turn to the use of patient preference data to inform reimbursement, and briefly consider what the interest is on the part of the HTA agencies and what their current use is. But as I said, I'll then really spend the majority of the presentation just looking at what the options are for incorporating patient preferences into reimbursement decision making, and then briefly consider what the implications are, both from a research but also from a manufacturer's perspective. So first of all, what do we mean by patient preferences and how are they being considered by regulatory agencies? So this is a quote that I've taken from the FDA. They've been doing some interesting thinking recently, and I'll dwell a little bit on that in a minute, on what they mean by what they interpret patient preferences to be and how they might use it. A lot of you may well be familiar with this, but I think just bear with me for those who might not be, and then we'll start to think about what that means for HTA in a minute. So the FDA defined patient preferences as relating to the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes that differ among alternative diagnostic and therapeutic strategies. So I'm very much interested here in the indirect elicitation of preferences. So we're interested in the attributes of treatment or other intervention options. And we're interested in the relative desirability or acceptability. So very much interested in trade-offs. So if we look at the sub-bullet points here, that data in the FDA's definition could be qualitative, looking at which outcomes might be of interest to patients, but also quantitative, looking at how much different attributes matter to patients, and in particular, as we just mentioned a minute ago, how they trade off one attribute against another. And it's very much following that latter definition, the quantitative information about how patients trade off treatment attributes, that I'm going to focus on today. I appreciate that there's a much broader agenda and research agenda as to how to incorporate patient voice into decision making of all types, not just HTA, but that will be my specific focus today. For those who might not be familiar with this field, just let me illustrate what I mean by that. So I'm very much going to refer to or focus in on discrete choice experiments as a source of this data today. I do appreciate there are many other ways of collecting patient preference data of the type we defined, and they are techniques that we ourselves employ quite a lot. But for the sake of simplicity, and given it's by far the most prevalent, if not the default method in this space, I'm going to, for shorthand, refer to discrete choice experiments, or DCEs, as we go through this. What are they? This is an example of the type of question that a patient undertaking a DCE survey would face. They are presented with two usually hypothetical treatments or devices. They are defined by the attributes we're interested in understanding their preferences for, and asked which of the two devices or treatments they prefer. They're asked a similar question or the same question format between 10 and 15 times, with the attributes of the different choices varying, and each time asked to give their choice. There are variations on the theme, which I won't dwell on, but that's the basic format of a DCE question. And then we use econometric analyses to look at how the choice of hypothetical treatment varies with the attributes, and therefore what their preferences are for those attributes. And you get data that looks a little bit like this. This is the data that came from the DCE example I showed you earlier. I should say, actually, this is the data that the FDA themselves commissioned to inform their decision around the approval of a weight loss device. And I'll come back to how this data was used in a moment. But just to illustrate what the data is and how we can use it, let's simplify this for a minute. Let's just ignore all of the middle attributes and focus on the far left and right, weight loss and mortality risk, just for the sake of illustration. And with these data, I can look at how much mortality risk a patient would be willing to tolerate in exchange for different levels of weight loss. The preference scale on the vertical axis doesn't have any absolute meaning, it's a relative scale. But when you compare across attributes, we can look at how patients go about making those trade-offs. So in this instance, I can see that if they give a patient a 30% weight loss, they will rate that as being a roughly 4.5 on my relative preference scale. And if I look then at my mortality risk scale and go down to minus 4.5, I can see that a patient would be willing to put up with at least 1% mortality risk in exchange for that weight loss. And that information can be used by decision makers to determine in this instance whether or not the benefit-risk balance was positive or not. And we'll think about how we can use that data in HTA context in a minute. So how is the FDA using that data? Well, that was a weight loss device that was approved, at least partly on the basis of that data. Using the preference information, the FDA identified a subgroup of patients who would be willing to accept increased risks for the weight loss benefits of the device, and it was approved on the basis of that, which was something of a milestone. More recently, they've published, in particular, CDRH, the devices arm of the FDA, has published guidance on how to collect patient preference data, and also via that guidance encouraging the voluntary submission of that patient preference data. And that guidance goes as far as starting to think through how that data might inform labelling, but that is something we haven't seen happen yet. We also see a similar agenda over here in Europe. The EMA's engagement with preference methods like this really was initiated back with their benefit risk methodology project that looked at different ways of balancing benefits and risks between 2009 and 11. More recently, they've been thinking about how patient preferences might be incorporated into that balancing of benefits and risks, and piloting a number of patient preference methodologies. And more recently still, and I think this is going to be very much the media through which we'll see developments in the policy space in Europe over the coming years. The IMI Prefer project is a collection of regulators, industry, HTA bodies, academia, with the goal of considering how to use patient preference data for various means, and I'll come back to that in the context of HTA in a minute. So hopefully that gives you a feel for what I mean by patient preference and the fact that there's actually quite a lot of activity in the regulatory space. Given the potential synergies between data we can collect for regulatory purposes and HTA, it'd be interesting to explore to what extent we can use that data for HTA and submission to HTA agencies. So first of all, let me look at what the current status is with regards to HTA agencies and their interest in and use of this data. So to take a step back for a minute, just to contextualize this specific type of patient information, there is quite a lot of activity at the minute in regards to that reimbursement and HTA space as to how the patient is involved. To one degree or another, patients obviously have been involved in HTA decision making, but there's been a lot more research effort focused on that question recently. Somewhat notably, in the last year or so, Kevin Marsh and colleagues published a collection of papers called Patient Involvement in Health Technology Assessment, which explored that much broader perspective. And I've just kind of drawn a couple of insights on the motivations for incorporating the patient in HTA that helps us contextualize the specific type of patient information we're talking about today. So if you look at the right-hand column, there are a number of values identified in reading that in the numbers of studies in that paper that might motivate us in incorporating patients into HTA. Fairness and legitimacy. Patients are a stakeholder in this process. They have a right to participate. They will be affected by the decision, so they should participate. Decisions will be more legitimate if those that are affected are incorporated into the decision-making process. Then also the patient has information that is useful to the decision. They have knowledge on the benefits and risks of treatment, but they also can help us understand their needs and how needs vary between different patient groups. So you might summarize those various motivations in two ways that patient involvement can strengthen HTA. First of all, they can participate in the HTA process. For instance, though not exclusively, you might be thinking about having the patient representatives on the committee that makes the decision. But equally, research into the patient's perspective is useful data for decision makers, whether those decision makers involve patients or otherwise. And there we might be thinking of different ways of different things we can elicit from the patient, what their experience of the disease, but also what their preferences are for the attributes of treatment. So with that in mind, if we start to think about, and I will use NICE in their reference case as something of a heuristic in this presentation. I do appreciate, though, that that isn't always the way that HTA is undertaken. But for the sake of simplicity, I will do that. So if we look at how they go about thinking, what analysis they undertake to inform their decisions, while there are a lot of factors that inform the NICE appraisal, the ISA is a crucial part of that jigsaw. So there we're talking about the increase in costs usually, and what increase in effectiveness is achieved for that increase in cost. Effectiveness is in the NICE reference case usually defined in terms of quality of life, and in turn uses the quality metric in order to measure effectiveness, and that itself comprises both the years of life that a patient experiences and the utility they have in each of those years of life. And if we then break that down further, methodologies to estimate utility that are incorporated into that involve two components: the patient experience, so their description of their health states and how that changes with treatment, but general population preferences. So the current status per the reference case of NICE, and I think this would probably extend more broadly, is that whilst the patient experience is relevant, the patient preference isn't actually formally incorporated into the analytical framework. It's the general population's preferences for different patient experiences. We'll come back to that. If we then look at how the patients are involved, again we don't see patient preferences currently coming to the fore. This is an output from a piece of work undertaken by HTAI's Patient and Citizen Involvement Interest Subgroup, who looked at good practice in the incorporation of patients into HTA and looked at what practice looked like across a range of different agencies. And if you look at my summary of those findings, you can see that we don't see much quantitative engagement with patients, and much of this is involvement in the committees themselves. So we've got qualitative interviews with patients, written statements from organisations, consumer reps or patient reps sitting on committees, consultations with patient groups. So it's very qualitative, and it's very if it's in the researching the patient experience, it's qualitative, and otherwise we're very much looking here at patient participation rather than researching patient experiences or preferences. So no quantitative elicitation of patient preferences emerging from that review. There is interest, however, in changing that. So to go back to the IMI Prefer project and look more specifically at its goals, we see that they state that the experience of the 5 years of research and consultation that it will undertake will provide a better understanding of what will be a recommended best practice approach to patient preference studies, and show how patient preference studies can provide valuable information to support decision making for regulators and HTA bodies. So part of the process, part of the goal of that initiative is to think through how HTA agencies can use this data, and a number of those agencies are part of that initiative. So particularly by this quite important initiative, we see an interest in HTA agencies to increase the use of that data. On an agency individual level as well, we also see a number of activities. Again, I'm just going to point to NICE for the sake of simplicity, but they have, in the last year or so, kicked off a collaboration with Melanoma UK, who have provided NICE with a grant to do research into how patient preferences might be incorporated into the various activities that NICE undertake, but including their HTA activities. So again, we've got HTA agencies expressing interest, but very much in an exploratory state. So not a huge amount of current activity on the part of the HTA agencies, but certainly an interest and an exploration of what they might do with patient preference data. So with that in mind, let's turn to what some of the options might be for how patient preference data could inform HTA or reimbursement decisions. Let me start with ICWIC. I think ICWIC probably represents the agency that has for most and probably the only, about patient preference data, probably the only agency that explicitly requests this data. So this is an extract from their General Methods Guide, published a couple of years ago, and it states that in certain circumstances, and those circumstances are when an economic evaluation is undertaken, that isn't always the case in ICWIC. Negotiations often stop short of that requirement, but where that is required, then an overall benefit measure would be generated to inform the economic evaluation, and that would be based upon a multi-criteria decision-making approach to determine the preferences, patient preferences, for the different endpoints or benefits and risks generated by that treatment. And they particularly point to the hierarchy process and conjoint analysis, which is shorthand for DCE in this circumstance, as ways of doing that. So ICWIC very explicitly pointing to this as data that they could use. They have undertaken a couple of pilots to illustrate how that data might be collected and to assess the methodologies that we can use for that purpose, one of which was a DCE. This was undertaken by Axel Muhlbacher and colleagues. I'm just going to show you very quickly what that looked like. This was in the area of hepatitis C, and as you can see, I won't run through the specific design of this DCE, but as we described earlier, this is the standard format for a DCE, a number of hypothetical choices based upon varying treatment attributes. So a DCE was undertaken with hepatitis C patients, and similar to the data we described earlier, this is presented in a slightly different format, but it's exactly the same information. The analysis of that data revealed the relative preference for changes in each of those different attributes. I do appreciate that some of the detail of this slide is a little difficult to see, but I'm not so much wanting to call attention to specific data on specific attributes, but just to illustrate the fact that the DCE was undertaken in those circumstances. And then having converted that into an alternative presentational formats, in this instance, looking at relative importance of attributes normalized so that the most important was 10. That's as far as the ICWIC pilot took it, though Muhlbacher and colleagues have taken this a step further to publish on how ICWIC might then use that data in order to undertake an economic evaluation. So just very briefly outline what that would look like. So having got our relative importance data from our DCE, Muhlbacher and colleagues propose an MCDA type analysis. And to briefly describe that, you see the utility function that they're proposing here, which in essence is simply a weighted average of the performance on the different endpoints of interest. So beta here being the normalized relative importance of the attributes extracted from the DCE. That in essence is a weight in MCDA terminology. And then that's combined with a measure of the performance of each treatment on each of those different attributes in a manner that would equate to a score of a partial value in MCDA circumstances. So you can see by that function there, that function DA is basically a conversion of the performance of each treatment on each attribute onto a 0 to 100 scale, which you might see in MCDA. So there's a conversion of the DCE data into an MCDA format, but in essence, the relative preferences are maintained. The output from that would be of the type that you can see here. So Muhlbacher and Sandler applied that methodology to evaluate Hep C treatments. As you can see here, options A to J, and applying that aggregation function, they estimated an overall benefit of each of those that you can see in the column on the right there. Again, I'm not too interested in the specific treatments or their ordering here, but just following through the logic of how the preference data was used. They then took that a step further, plotted those benefit data against the cost of the treatments, akin to the efficiency frontier methodology that ICWIC is favourable of. You can apply that methodology with the overall benefit estimate generated from the preference data to look at how improvements in that benefit function can be generated for different levels of cost. So that's what ICWIC is thinking, and whilst it's still exploratory, as you can get a sense of the way I discussed that, how that data might be used to inform the economic evaluation for ICWIC. But other HTA agencies pose different decision problems. So again, just going back to NICE, if we look at the figure on the left, this is taken from, this is them describing their aspiration for what value-based assessment might look like when they were consulting on this a couple of years ago. Precisely whether or not this is perfectly accurate of their current process or not, I don't know, but I think the principle underlying it is still current, and that is that in essence here we have a measure of health that each patient receiving a treatment may gain, and the value they put on that, NICE, will depend upon a number of attributes of the treatment. The burden of illness of that patient group, wider societal impact generated by that treatment, whether it's innovative, etc. This is a very different decision problem. The decision problem that ICWIC was posing was one of trading off treatment attributes within a therapy area. This is a societal level decision problem, and that poses more challenges if we're trying to think through how to use patient preference data. Beyond the tariffs to generate qualities that we discussed earlier, there is some possibility and also example of the use of methods like discrete choice experiment in the context of UK decision making. But that is undertaken or recommended to be undertaken with, again, with general population preferences. If we're trying to trade off, trying to decide whether or not to treat patient group A or patient group B, both with very different decisions at a societal level, then general population preferences are those the ones that NICE has deemed pertinent. So we do see, for instance, NICE is highly specialized technology, decision-making, using data on the disutility of treatment administration, infusion, for instance, and incorporating that into the overall NICE analyses, but again with general population preferences. And the Scottish Medicines Consortium very explicitly states we can use DCEs with a justification, but again, we're talking about general population preferences. If we cast the net a little bit more broadly, very briefly, this is an extract from some training that myself and a number of people give at ISPOR twice a year on the use of MCDA to support health technology assessment. If you can look at the different frameworks we identified there for incorporating preferences via an MCDA into HTA, again, with the exception of Germany, that we just discussed already in the middle there, you can see that the stakeholders' preferences are general population or the decision makers themselves, eliciting the preferences of the committee, not patients. So again, this points to the different decision problem that those HTA agencies pose themselves. It differs from that in Germany. So we might want to distinguish in thinking through how we use patient preferences at least two forms of decision problem. Whether or not the decision is therapy area specific, which is the most efficient treatment to offer for this patient group, for this therapy, in this therapy area, such as ICWIC, where we can use patient preference data to estimate utility and efficiency, versus a more universal methodology applied to undertake a social allocation. And let's think a little bit more about how we might go about using preference data in those circumstances. So if we go back to Facey et al.'s recent publication, there is a chapter in there, chapter 10, on discrete choice experiments and how they could be used to inform HTA decision making. Here's a couple of extracts on that. So DCs provide potentially useful information within a HTA decision-making context, what characteristics are important, how important they are, trade-offs between the characteristics, monetary measures of value, and predictions of take-up rates. And they articulate another more specific use, which is in the context of broadening the valuation space. The attributes in the DC literature have focused on describing healthcare processes, waiting times, frequencies of treatments, for instance. So measuring what they refer to as process utility. So those are some various options we might explore. We look to another source for how we might use patient preference data, and that is a publication, a review a couple of years ago published by Vernon et al. That identified use of patient preference data, more generally, not just patient preference data, but preference data in healthcare decision making. Table 1 here summarizes their findings. They distinguish benefit-risk assessment, akin to the regulatory decision problem, from HTA, and they distinguish different methods, matching methods like TTO, time trade-off, or discrete choice experiments we mentioned. We've alluded to multi-criteria decision analysis methods as well. They distinguish those two. So you can see they actually identified 68 publications on the use of preference data in health technology assessment. They provide more detail on 10 of those. And the split of those is that 4 of those were looking at general population preferences, 1 on physician preferences, but 5 of them looked at patient preferences. So again, this is an insight into how we might think about patient preferences in a HTA context. So 2 of those papers were using patient preferences to estimate utility, with the purpose of incorporating a broader notion of utility into cost-effectiveness analysis. So we can think about that. 2 of them were looking at patients' willingness to pay for treatments. And finally, 1 of them was looking at data on continuation of treatment. So similar themes emerging as we saw in the PSI publication in terms of the potential uses of patient preference in data here. So let's explore those a bit more. So option 2 then, therefore, is the use of preference data, patient preference data, to measure process utility to incorporate into HTA. So we go back to that schema of the NICE reference case. In essence, what we're proposing to do here is to take that broader notion of health-related utility and add to it a notion of process utility. So we're not just looking at how health outcomes affect patients and how we value those, but also how treatment administration, be it the mode of that administration or the waiting time, might affect a patient's utility as well. But we run up against the fact that collecting that data from a patient is tantamount to mixing perspectives. So as we mentioned earlier, we've got patient experience, but general population preferences informing our overall health gain, are the utility associated with health gain. So whilst NICE's reference case doesn't explicitly address this point, really we should be looking at patients' experience of different processes, but the general population's preferences for paying for those improvements. So again, this isn't obvious, it's not immediately obvious how we incorporate process utility into the analytical framework currently used by NICE and others. Turning to option 3, patients' willingness to pay for treatments or treatment attributes. In essence, what we're doing here is moving to a cost-benefit type framework, or some of the notion of net monetary benefit. So that's represented by this function here, where in essence what we're saying is we look at the change in health, E1 minus E0, and look at our willingness to pay for that. From that, remove the increase in cost, and then also add to that the improvement in a broader set of values based upon our willingness to pay for that broader set of benefits, O1 minus O0 here. But again, we run into an issue of perspective. So we could elicit patients' values for other benefits and estimate beta based upon patients' preferences. But if we did that, we would be mixing patients' preferences with, possibly, depending on how we did this, general population preferences. So we could use NICE's threshold to estimate willingness to pay for health gain. Equally, we don't necessarily need to mix preferences and use patient preferences for health gain, but again, that doesn't meet NICE's reference case. They're explicitly interested in general population preferences. So again, we're struggling to bring the patient in this way. The 4th option we identified in PSI and learning a moment ago was uptake. We can use patient preferences to predict the likelihood they will adopt a treatment or continue to take a treatment should they be prescribed it. So recently we see a paper published that outlined this conceptually. This is a letter to Health Economics, and this letter, as you can see in the highlighted box, proposes using uptake projections from discrete choice experiments to better parameterize uptake and substitution in cost-effectiveness models. So let's think a little bit about that. So going back to our NICE reference case, both the cost and the effectiveness or utility components of this will be premised on either implicitly some assumptions or some explicit modeling of the likelihood that patients will continue on a treatment, or they will discontinue taking that treatment for whatever reason. This proposal is that if we can understand patients' preferences for treatment attributes, we can predict whether or not they would maintain or continue to take a treatment. There are different ways of doing that. So if you look at option 1 here, this is simply just the utility function that describes the analyses that is undertaken of the discrete choice data we discussed earlier. All I want to do with this is just to illustrate using this is a fairly standard description of the analyses, that utility data can be translated into the probability that a patient would prefer one treatment or another. You could construct this analysis such that you can say, would a patient prefer to be on the treatment or to simply stop taking the treatment and either revert to nothing if they simply don't adhere, or switch and revert to a comparator, depending upon how we pose that problem. So we can look at the likelihood that a patient prefers one treatment over another based upon the outcome from the DCE. We can use that data in another way. Rather than using the utility function generated by the DCE, we can, more akin to Axel Muhlbacher's use of the DCE data in an MCDA format, we can then run the MCDA probabilistically to see what's the likelihood that a patient ranks our treatment first, second, or third. This figure just illustrates the type of output you get from that analysis. In an instance, we recently published an analysis of GOAX, and the SMAR acronym stands for Stochastic Multi-Criteria Acceptability Analysis, which is in essence just an MCDA run with a Monte Carlo simulation. Either way, and I know I've kind of drifted over things quite quickly, but either way we can estimate the probability that a patient prefers one treatment over some option. We can construct that problem differently, and that can be incorporated as a parameter into our economic analyses, changing cost and effectiveness accordingly. The challenge there is that, at least as our current understanding stands, assessments of the external validity of patient preferences, so our ability to predict whether patient choice from, for instance, DCEs, produces mixed results. So there is not a huge amount of literature on this topic, a handful of papers in the healthcare domain. Some of those produce positive results and some of them don't in terms of our ability to predict patient choice. So that needs a little bit further thinking. So returning to our typology of HTA decision problems, if we go back to that universal analyses or social application problem, what we might suggest is that from a estimating of the utility and or cost of a treatment per the current analytical frameworks adopted by organizations like NICE, we're probably looking at using DCEs as a way of predicting uptake or adherence. That's consistent with the reference case and the perspective adopted by the reference case. There's a little work needed to make sure that those methods are working appropriately, but that would be a way to incorporate patient preferences into decision making without completely changing the perspective of that analysis. Other information, which is often collected, be it process utility or willingness to pay, can be useful, but probably as supporting information rather than as fulfilling agencies' core analytical needs. So with that in mind, what are the implications of some of those suggestions? And I'll end with this slide. And I think from a submissions point of view, if we're thinking about a manufacturer deciding whether or not to use this data and how to use this data, I think I would call out two key lessons. First of all, plan early. So as we're seeing more and more of this data being collected for regulatory purposes, there is the potential to also use that data for HTA purposes. And if we think that's an important use or potential use we might want to explore, it's important to understand that need at the point of designing the study. And I know a number of our clients are working on how best to organize the common data needs of different teams that is posed by this challenge, and looking at solutions for coordinating data collection early that can be used for multiple purposes later. So planning early is a crucial lesson here. But I think another recommendation, and one that we're actively employing at the moment, is to also consult payers. So I think one of the things that hopefully I've illustrated is that this issue is very much in the exploratory phase. And while that is the case, I think on a case-by-case basis, it's important to consult payers to get a view as to what might be the appropriate use of patient preference data, what they would be willing to accept and find useful. The other theme that I think emerges from this is that of a research agenda that needs fulfilling. So if we look at ICWIC's conclusion of their pilot of conjoint analysis, or DCE, they concluded that in principle, it was suitable to find out which preferences patients have regarding treatment goals. However, some primary methodological issues still need to be clarified, and they emphasise two things. First of all, how representative the selection of respondents has to be, and secondly, determining which degree of precision is required in the way that they collect their preference data. So an acknowledgement that this data is useful, but also an acknowledgement that the application of these methods raises a number of questions. We've alluded to the question of external validity, which is an important one a few moments ago. That isn't the only question that these methods raise. And if you look actually at the FDA's position on this too, I think they acknowledge that more research, again, that this new research is valuable and they want it now, but in parallel with that activity, more research is required to help understand which methods are appropriate in which circumstances, and to give committees some reassurance that the data they're getting is reliable and valid. So there is an important research agenda here, and institutions like IMI Prefer, that we've referred to a few times, are starting, amongst others, I should say, are starting to deliver on that research agenda and hopefully allow us to answer some of those questions in the near future. And with that, I thank you for your attendance, and I would be very interested in hearing your questions, but also your views on this topic, given how early we are in thinking through some of these issues.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, for this very, very nice presentation. For questions, please type them into the chat functionality, and then we will follow up on that. In terms of your conclusions, I would have my first question as a follow-up. In terms of the representativeness of the patient preferences, what tools do you see there are available to see how different patient characteristics might have an impact on patient preferences? And have you seen any of these used in any HTA settings?
Yeah, I think that's something that has been emphasised quite strongly by the regulators. And I think it's nicely illustrated by the weight loss device that we showed, in that one of the key outcomes from that was understanding patient heterogeneity in their preferences, and how that heterogeneity might influence what the benefit-risk balance looks like for different patient groups. So given that likelihood, the regulators are emphasising quite strongly the importance to think through how we measure heterogeneity when we're designing patient preference studies. I don't see that coming very strongly from the HTA agencies yet, but I'd be very surprised if that interest wasn't mirrored when we start to see more explicitly what the HTA agencies are interested in. So definitely important. In terms of techniques, I suppose the only technique that that develops specific methodologies for understanding patient heterogeneity is the DCE. I know we've kind of focused almost exclusively on that today at the expense of others, but there are a number of techniques, place and class models, random parameter logit models, that can be used to characterize heterogeneity in the preference set that we collect. Other techniques maybe don't have very specific methodologies developed for them, though kind of standard logic identifying potential subgroups and exploring differences in preferences between subgroups is obviously applicable there. The challenge, regardless of which methodology we use, is that as we go down that path, the more we want to understand heterogeneity, the more power we need, the greater the sample sizes we need in order to be able to do that. So that becomes a challenge, particularly in areas where patient groups are hard to reach, or in some instances very, very small, or both of those two things. So obviously there's a trade-off there in terms of the data we get, but also the expense of getting that data. But there are techniques that are available, and certainly a need for that data by decision makers.
Yeah, I think the other point is, if you have both variability in terms of the treatment effects across different patient groups, as well as patient preferences across different treatment groups, then you basically need to handle this subgroup topic on both ends of the equation, so to say. Or if you look into the MCDA topic, you have that both as a coefficient of the preference, as well as in the factor that describes the treatment effect. So I think that's a pretty complex scenario. In terms of that, we recently had a presentation about a case study which showed how to collect the patient as well as the physician preferences during the randomized clinical trials, which also looked into the treatment effects. What's your point of view, or what's your experience also generally, but also specifically in the HTA area? Is it good to collect these patient preferences within the RCTs, so maybe within the phase 3 program, or within special studies that are only used then for HTA purposes, like we see more and more in Germany? Or is it better to run these patient preference surveys outside of the clinical trials, which will probably have also some positive sides on it?
Yeah, I think it's often something that we explore on our projects, and we struggle to get that data for two reasons. One is that oftentimes at the point at which we are planning and implementing this work, it might be too late to achieve that goal. To my point earlier about the importance of early planning, particularly with an area of research that is relatively novel like this, we often don't see that early planning, though I'm very pleased to say that we're seeing more and more of it. That's often a challenge. It's not possible given when we get involved and start our projects. The other is that depending upon the disease area, if a patient group is hard to reach and difficult to recruit, including this as an extra requirement on them is seen as a challenge. We don't want to jeopardize the success of the trial by increasing the burden on the patient and reducing the likelihood that they continue to participate and don't drop out of the trial. So there sometimes is a reluctance, depending upon the patient group or the therapy area, to add further informational requirements on that trial population. So those two things often cause us to not be able to achieve that goal, though I think there are obvious benefits of doing that. I think you've got then preference and performance data from the same population, so you can be sure that you can obviously try and collect preference data on a similar population. You know what your inclusion and exclusion criteria are for the trial. You can go and mimic that. So you can try and get that data and match the population as close as possible. But if you get it from the trial population, that's obviously you're sure you're getting data that matches. So it is something we often try and achieve, though, and I think we will, as people start to understand the data and the needs for the data, we'll start to see it. I mean, on the flip side, whilst in certain populations the burden can be prohibitive in terms of this approach, in others, collecting this data from patients we've already identified and recruited, and it's a marginal extra effort on the part of the patient, and also in actual fact an efficiency in terms of running research, is obviously a huge benefit as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it also depends on the disease area. So sometimes you have very, very large studies that you need for the phase 3, either to show efficacy or to collect lots of safety information. And then maybe you need to run this survey only on a much smaller subgroup of the overall RCT population.
Yeah.
where sometimes the RCTs are maybe really, really small, and you would need much more sample size for this survey patients. Of course, the other thing is in terms of generalizability, RCT patients are very, very special patients. Depends a little bit on the different indications, but sometimes very special. And of course, then you could be challenged how much the preference is actually generalizable to the overall overall population.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And just in the context of that, of this idea, I mean, I think probably also worthwhile acknowledging that we defined our notion of preference reasonably narrowly earlier in the presentation. So indirect elicitation of patient preferences for treatment attributes. There is obviously a more direct way of eliciting patient preferences, particularly where you've got crossover trials or trials where patients have experienced comparative treatments ahead, prior to enrollment. You can ask patients' preferences directly for one treatment or another. And that data has recently made it into a FDA label for an oncology treatment where patients' preferences collected that way as part of a trial, so an endpoint in a trial, their preference for that treatment versus another was not only collected but also used in the label.
So in terms of direct versus indirect, just to clarify that, indirect means there's these hypothetical scenarios, and you the patients select these different hypothetical scenarios, and direct, well, patients have experienced treatment A and treatment B, and then they really decide. Okay. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I think I have seen such data, for example, for erectile dysfunction for different compounds there. Going back to the NICE example, I wanted to follow up. I understand the EQ5D is basically the tool of how we define utility currently. So how does patient preferences feed into the EQ5D utility?
Yeah, they currently don't. I mean, patients' experiences do. So, in fact, even if we're not using the EQ5, even if you want to use a different instrument to measure utility, it'll be the patient experience that defines the levels of the attributes. It will even define the attributes themselves, including that instrument oftentimes. So we are characterizing what the patient is experiencing as they're receiving treatment and their disease is progressing. But then in terms of how we bundle all that together into an overall measure of utility and how we trade off one endpoint against another, so pain versus social function, how we trade those things off in produce an aggregate measure of utility, that isn't patient preferences, that is general population preferences that are used to do that, on the basis that it is the taxpayer and the general population whose preferences we are attempting to channel and represent when we're making these decisions. They should decide the relative value of social function versus pain, for instance. So at the minute, patient preferences don't feature very strongly in that type of decision.
Okay, thanks a lot. There's another question, and that's a little bit beyond the kind of HTA topic. It's more kind of generally working between quantitative people, so to say. So on the one hand, we have the pharma sponsors that very often outsource these studies to companies like Evidera, where you would be actually running, analyzing, and reporting back the outcomes. What's your experience in terms of you working with statisticians within the different pharma companies, and where do you see, could be statisticians within the pharma companies play a bigger role? How could, statisticians within the companies maybe should have a different role? What's your perception on these interactions?
Yeah. Interestingly, we do tend to do a lot of work with statisticians or with groups who are close to the statisticians when we're doing this work, particularly motivated by the regulatory space. The groups of statisticians and epidemiologists, etc., that have traditionally received and responded to FDA requests for data have been are also now receiving these requests for preference insights. And consequently, they are the ones who are having to think through how to field those requests. So I think, interestingly, we're getting a lot of statisticians involved in this work. So 3 quick observations, I think. I mean, one is that statisticians are seeing, as a consequence of that dynamic I described, they're seeing the need for this work. They're also involved in the design of studies, going back to that issue of early planning. So I think statisticians are quite well placed at the minute to understand that this is something that is ultimately required, but also I'd like to think at least had a role in the design of trials, etc., earlier in the process than those receipts are being sent from received from the FDA. So I think statisticians have an important role in terms of advocating for and facilitating the early thinking on these methods. 2 then very quick practical observations about our experiences with statisticians. First of all, there are other instances where they aren't involved and sometimes need to be involved. So when we do this work a little later in the process, maybe just ahead of some form of submission, what we tend to find is once we've worked through the attributes that we want to include in our study, defined those, dealt with issues of overlap. So for instance, sometimes you find yourself unpicking an endpoint because it includes various different events, be they related to the disease or the adverse events or death. Now that's a very hard attribute for a patient to value. It is heterogeneous in its components, so we end up trying to peel those things apart. That often then needs to go back to statisticians, trial statisticians, to generate data from the trial. Now, a couple of challenges with that. Obviously, the trial hasn't necessarily been designed to estimate those outcomes. So we really want to be anticipating that early, as we said, designing the trials, etc., with those things in mind. But also, just simply statistician capacity. Oftentimes, you then find these requests landing on statisticians' desks who are very, very busy people. So I think there's a very practical issue there as to how we work with statisticians. This is where they're not themselves leading this work. The other interesting observation is that when we find statisticians leading the work, and I think most of them would probably agree with this, though I'd be interested to hear otherwise, is that the statistician skill set doesn't naturally lend itself well to preference elicitation. It's a very different type of research. And so I think there's a disjunct there. One of the challenges I think statisticians are having is how to get, internally or externally, how to get the appropriate input into these analyses, be it from their internal HEOR colleagues, where the health economists might have more familiarity with these methods, or from external organizations like ourselves.
Yeah. I would say that there is some more training needed across lots of different statisticians to get familiar with this type of data, with these type of experiments, which are, let's say, not fitting into the standard clinical trial design, standard, just comparing treatments in terms of efficacy and safety. It's different approaches needed here, and I think also a little bit of a different mindset. What I found really interesting is that we can learn actually a lot from health economics here, where I think there is a much more wider use of these types of techniques, whereas in the medical field, that seems to be much more kind of a new approach, where it's maybe not so new in other areas. So we are nearly on top of the hour. So I want to say a big thank you, Kevin, for you to spend this hour with us. We have recorded this webinar, so we will make that available on our homepage in the next weeks. Kevin also agreed to share the slides with us, so the PDF of these slides will also be available on the homepage. So with that, I want to close this webinar with a final note that please share this webinar with others that might be interested, and subscribe to our newsletter so you don't miss any of the future updates here. Thanks a lot.